The name Titanic elicits two responses in most people. The brain thinks of two things at once. People are obviously aware of the actual sinking that occurred in 1912, and that it was a real vessel that encountered a dangerous circumstance, ending over 1,000 lives. But the mind also wavers in another, probably more prominent direction. The Titanic is much more of a powerful pop culture sensation due to the enormously successful 1997 film directed by James Cameron. Vast amounts of people are much more interested in the story of Titanic because of this film, and not the magnitude of the real disaster. And it's clear as to why. It's probably more socially acceptable to have an interest in a popular romance film than to have a keen interest in a historical event. It's easy to credit the 1997 film for the Titanic's commercial popularity and existence in the contemporary public consciousness, but that's not entirely the case. In fact, the very first film made regarding Titanic was released less than a month after the disaster happened. I am not fucking with you. If you're into lost media and arrived on my channel with my Incarnation Basharas video, then you may already be aware of this, as no copies of the film are still available, and is a high-profile lost media case. If you aren't aware of the film, however, then Saved from the Titanic was filmed in less than a week, co-wrote and starred in by the real Titanic survivor Dorothy Gibson, who wore the very same outfit on set that she wore on the Titanic. The film was released on the 16th of May 1912, only 31 days after the tragedy. Gibson actually had a mental breakdown while producing the short film, and it's pretty easy to see why. It seems insane to me that anyone would want to write and act in a story about a traumatic disaster that they themselves witnessed, but it shows just how popular and widely discussed the Titanic was as a subject, even in the 1910s. But Saved from the Titanic is not nearly the weirdest Titanic film created. And neither is the 1943 film simply titled Titanic, but I'll mention it in this video purely because of how bizarre it is. Is it just a poorly made, historically inaccurate and incredibly dated recollection of the Titanic story? Not exactly. This film was produced by the Nazi propaganda machine to portray English society as responsible for the many deaths that occurred, and being more interested in wealth and greed, as well as portraying Germany as strong and heroic, through the protagonist of the story, a fictional German officer. This was an example of one of the many propaganda films made to maintain order and German pride during the Nazis' dictatorial reign in Germany. Unlike some of the films that were made by direct order of Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, Titanic was produced by a film company that had existed since 1920, Tobis Film, and conceived by a writer at the studio. This production was, of course, however, influenced by the control that the German state had over the media, and the Ministry of Propaganda itself. Goebbels also directly assisted in financing the production. The film is also memorable for being a complete disaster. Helmut Selpen, the first director, was arrested during the production process, and the film was later banned, as Goebbels thought that scenes of mass panic, distress and death would weaken morale during the Second World War, despite the film having an enormous budget, including many accurate set details and a 30-foot miniature model of the Titanic. The question of whether 1943's Titanic is historically accurate or not doesn't really matter, as the film didn't serve to tell the real story, but to push an evil agenda and narrative. We've so far covered films that came out not so long after the initial tragedy, but what happens when we fast forward to the early 21st century, after the intense popularisation and commercialisation of the Titanic by James Cameron's 1997 feature film? That, my friends, is a dive into the weirdest and most convoluted depths of Titanic cinematic hell. 2000's Titanic The Legend Goes On is a horrible animated attempt to cash in on the popularisation of the Titanic at the time, which includes a fictional love story on board the ship. It also seems to cash in on the recent trend of animated Disney movies, featuring various talking and singing animals, including mice, geese, a magpie, and this ultra cool rapping dog.
So don't sweat it, forget it, enjoy the show. Working all day, now it's time to unwind. Kick back, relax, take a load off your mind. I'll be busting the moves and I'll be busting the rhymes. We'll be busting up laughing cause it's party time. Everybody's feeling fine cause it's party time.
You can tell the producers couldn't give less of a shit about the Titanic itself, but saw the commercial success of the James Cameron film and decided to milk the Titanic bandwagon while incorporating some quirky new elements. But to be fair, Titanic The Legend Goes On is pretty inoffensive when it comes to film depictions of the famous shipwreck. It serves as a stupid and fun way for children to get interested in the story, at the very least. But what if these kids stayed this stupid into their later life? What if they grow up to be clueless, low intelligence, slop-consuming adults that will watch and enjoy any old crap that happens to include so-called pop culture references such as the Titanic? I remember seeing this fake trailer for Titanic 2 as a kid, and it's a clear indicator as to how popular the 1997 film was. People were yearning for some kind of sequel, and there was indeed a Titanic 2 that released in 2010. And it is as weird and dumb as you can possibly imagine. Made by the Asylum, an American film studio, the second Titanic is actually a real ship, docked in Long Beach, California, the Queen Mary, with the name Titanic 2 slapped on the side of it. But every animated exterior shot at sea looks just like the original Titanic, which shows just how low the film's budget was and how lazy the production was. Of course, this depiction has to be much more grand in scale, explosive, and over the top than the actual event, so the film's plot sees a tsunami catapult an iceberg into the Titanic 2's hull, and then, of course, it fucking explodes into flames just to add more spectacle. But this plot is completely normal in comparison to Titanic 666, which released in 2022, once again produced by the Asylum, and just one look at the poster for this film and you can tell we're in for a wild ride. The plot follows the Titanic 3, which actually looks like the Titanic this time, and wait, that's the Queen Mary again. I realise a lot of people won't notice, but if you really examine the exterior shots of the ship and then the one they actually use for the live action shots, then they look completely different, and it's just a reminder of how incompetent the producers are to use the same ship 12 years later. After a satanic ritual takes place on the ship, the ghosts of the original Titanic victims haunt the passengers, which is for one thing incredibly cheesy, but also in incredibly bad taste to say the least. Imagine dying in one of the most deadly shipwrecks of all time, and 110 years later you're depicted as a murderous ghost in a crappy, low-budget horror movie. Or hell, am I wrong? Is the Titanic disaster long ago enough that we can now start making fun of the tragedy? There's an old video by David Mitchell that explains this quite well.
I suspect the answer is that it happened a long time ago, so it's funny. Just as all historical events, however bloody and violent, eventually become funny. Even the most radioactive material has a half-life. The raping Vikings are funny because we're not picturing rapists, we're picturing Vikings. Cartoon Vikings with ginger beards and horns on their helmets, which they didn't have, by the way. And we're not picturing real victims either. We're picturing buxom carry-on milkmaids who are bored with Anglo-Saxon kings burning their cakes all the time and are quite looking forward to some Norse nookie. And maybe in 500 years' time, we'll imagine the Red Army arriving in East Berlin in exactly the same way.
So, has the Titanic completely lost its meaning and is now just a commercial pop culture icon? Just something that meaninglessly exists in the public consciousness that can be retold and represented in any way possible simply because it is the most popular, famous and recognisable ship in history? Was the real historical event replaced by a subjective and glamorised story in 1997, resulting in many different possibilities in how to retell the story of Titanic? That very well may be true, and it's now inevitable that in just a matter of time, the next wild and bizarre Titanic story is cooked up by some small or even big budget studio. Let's just wait and see.